I'd like to show you a beautiful attacking game. This could go straight into the textbooks. It's wonderful. So played in the Generation Cup, the latest in the Meltwater Champions Chess Tour series, this online rapid event which is creating headlines. But I'd like to concentrate on some chess. So this is Jan-Krzysztof Duda, 24-year-old from Poland, remarkable talent, against Arjun Erigaisi, 19 years old, one of the next generation of Indian players, and having a great tournament actually. Nimzo Indian, and so far all very respectable mainline. Now, here one can play knight f3. This is the normal move in this Rubinstein variation. One can also play knight e2. But Duda goes for a3. Now, quite an uncompromising move because, you know, you're giving up a whole tempo to get the two bishops. But those two bishops can be powerful. But pretty normal. And knight e2, so that protects the pawn on c3, but also is in some ways a bit more aggressive than knight f3, as we're going to see, at least the way that Duda plays it. So queen c7, this is a veiled threat against the bishop because black threatens to take here, so the bishop has to come back. Knight c6. Now, in the past, I mean, this variation was really reckoned to be nothing special for white at all. Duda's next move is incredibly ambitious and, well, it's aimed at preventing e5. If black gets in e5, then there really isn't much wrong with black's position. There's so much pressure against d4. But this move changes the nature of the position, because if the pawn move e5 is prevented, then, well, that's means that white's central position is more secure. f4, incredibly aggressive, but very risky because it weakens that pawn on e3. It weakens the e4 square. In fact, the long diagonal is weakened as well. So yes, we all love chucking the f-pawn up the board. Well, you know, it's a staple of the English school of chess, if you think of the Grand Prix attack and, well, King's Gambit and all kinds of things. But actually, a very risky move because it ultimately weakens the king. It can rebound. But Duda has tried this before with success. And, you know, there have been other players that have tried this recently as well. Grishuk, for example. Rook d8, so yes, b6, the bishop looks to come into the game on the long diagonal, which looks very sensible. Previously, Duda has tried knight g3 in this position, but today he went for bishop b2. And this does look like an odd square for the bishop, because it's blocked by these pawns. So, well, let's see what happens. Bishop b7, yeah, that bishop looks far more effectively placed on the long diagonal. e4 from Duda, so incredibly ambitious, setting up this huge pawn center. This is all well and good if white survives, if this center remains intact, because that will give white a fantastic launch pad to attack the king. But let's see. I mean, black has, you know, various options here. b5 is an interesting move, giving the queen a square, looking perhaps to upset white with b4 or push on with c4. But knight a5 looks reasonable, because now these two pieces attack the pawn here. And if e5, that's a risky move, because after queen c6, black gets very quick counterplay against the pawn on g2. This is the big problem that white has. Got to be extremely careful how this center is advanced. Knight g3 just holds the pawn on e4 for the moment, looks reasonable, and also makes way for the queen. Yes, I know it can be taken at this moment, but you never know when that queen might enter the game on that diagonal somewhere. Rook c8. And now Duda pushes forward with e5. Well, if the queen comes here, then that pawn can be defended more easily, for example, by queen e2. Knight d5. So this looks pretty menacing. The knight can come to e3. It also might be able to get in on c3. Duda just ignores this. f5 and carries on with the attack. Now, this is, really bold. Remember, this is a rapid play game. 15 minutes on the clock, and then they get 10 seconds added per move. So there's not a huge amount of time to work out what's going on here. A lot of this is instinct, played on instinct. If that pawn is taken, then, of course, the knight leaps into the attack, and that's very dangerous. Knight e3. So the queen comes out to h5. And here, well, if that rook is taken, there's trouble on h7 already. Not to mention f6. One of those is going to win, basically. E takes f5, knight takes f5. Erigaisi doesn't have time to swipe the rook. Instead, exchanges off the knight on f5. So the rook recaptures, and if that rook moves, then h7 is en prise, can be taken. So g6 is pretty much forced. Now, of course, that weakens those dark squares around the king. But at the moment, there's only, I say only, it's bad enough, there's only the queen attacking. And that bishop is a long way from entering the game. Look, that bishop is here, and all those pawns stand in between. So is black's counterattack going to come good here? Or what can Duda manage to create on the king side? Queen g5. And now the threat is simply to bring the rook over and just to build up. And this is pretty nasty. So, for example, bishop d5, rook f1, and rook f6. And you don't even need the bishop here. White is going to crash through. It doesn't take too much to advance the h-pawn. And there are going to be threats here. Erigaisi took on d4. C takes d4. Okay, well now the diagonal, there are only 2 pawns in front of that bishop. That's interesting. Knight c4. Erigaisi would very much like to get rid of one of those bishops. But rook c1. That pin just slows down black for the moment. Bishop d5 defends. And here rook f6 is still pretty strong. But bishop takes knight. Well, if you give up bishop for knight, then you have to have a pretty good reason to do that. And now we are going to see Duda's strategy. This is fantastic. First of all, okay, well, you have a little think. maybe I've given so many hints as to what white is up to here. But you have a little think while I have a little slurp. Are you ready? Pawn to e6. So this is a wonderful clearance sacrifice. Naturally, the bishop can't take because of the pin. So pawn takes e6. And now the second clearance sacrifice, d5. There we go. And that bishop on b2, which a few moves ago, it looked very unpromising. All those pawns in front of it have disappeared. Now, this is a huge moment for Erigaisi. What does he play here? This is absolutely the peak of battle. It's reaching boiling point now. How should black try to defend this one? It's not so easy. Would you be able to resist taking that rook, or would you do something else? Well, in fact, it's best to resist the rook and take here, take the pawn. Even so, white has a very fierce attack, and this is extremely difficult to defend. But that is black's best. But Erigaisi took the rook. He said, okay, show me. What you got? So white, Duda, is a whole rook down. Queen f6. So there's this familiar battery on the long diagonal. The queen wants to come down. And the threat is to check on h8, check on g7, and then the king will be caught with a rook e1 check when it's on e8. I'm sure you can work that out. Therefore, Erigaisi took on d5. I suspect that he'd calculated a certain amount here and thought that he was surviving. Okay, I'll hand it over to you again. White to play and win. What would you play here with white? A little bit of calculation needed, a little bit of judgment as well. White to play and win. Well, this is a classic attacking situation where calculation is needed and you have to think, well, can you just chase the king? Is it possible to land a checkmate? Well, if the king goes back, then rook e1 looks deadly. So the king has to come forward. Okay, rook e1 anyway. The king runs across. Now, can you catch the king before it reaches safety? Well, queen f6, in fact, there is a safe square, king c5, and actually there's no way through for white there. The king has reached the safety of its own pieces, basically. It looked a bit drafty on the king's side, but it's far better placed on c5. Or alternatively, bishop e5 check. Well, that can be taken, and in fact, the king is secure in that position. That's my phone going off. Let's come back here. Nothing very important. Right, conclusion. If you calculate correctly, then just chasing the king with checks isn't going to work. But this is a classic attacking idea. You cut the king off, rook e1. And then the checks are going to be deadly. So there is immediately a threat of checking here. And when the king comes to f7, then queen g7 will be mate. This is the problem. So this is a beautiful move, a very typical idea, but of course every position is different. You have to work it out. And this is now lost. Black does not have a good defense. So bishop e2 was played. This is desperate. But basically, Erigaisi is trying to get some checks in with this move. But it's winning for white. Duda checked. Checked again. Took the bishop with check. And now this position is different. Because here, bishop e5 is actually winning. So there's a skewer. Threatens to take the queen. And after rook takes, in this case, there's no bishop here, which we had in the other position. And for example, king d7, check, and mate on e8. And in the game, king c6 was played, and now there's no bishop on c4, so rook c2 is simply winning the queen on c7 with a simple skewer. Now, you still need some technique to win this position, because you can see that black has a rook and two pawns against the queen, and everything is covered. You know, white can't create a passed pawn. So how do you win this? Well, in fact, you just have to create a Zugzwang position. So the king comes up the board. The rook has to keep hold of the pawn on h7. If that pawn is lost, then that one will go inevitably, and it's an easy win. And the rook has to guard the king as well. So White's king is able to enter the game. So this is nice actually. And well, I mean, it's Zugzwang. Let me just show you what happened. Queen d8 was played, and that was the final move of the game. Here, Erigaisi resigned. Let's just work out why. Black is already running very short of moves. So let's say a4. Okay, the king marches in. Notice the queen guards b6, so the king can't be checked away. If the rook comes back here, then it's just show that it's actually going to be mate. Queen a5. And if the rook moves this way, then, well, you can see that this pawn can be picked up, and that can be picked up. In fact, in this position, Queen d4 is actually picks up the rook. I didn't. That wasn't the most fortunate square for the queen, for the rook rather. Yeah, but let's say rook f7, and yeah, you can just pick up the pawns easily, and the rook inevitably will go. So what about waiting with h5? Well, that means that this pawn is now vulnerable, and that can be picked up. But I mean, this is another way to win as well. King takes, and those pawns are going to go. But yeah, for example. But yeah, once h5 is played, then the pawn on g6. All these pawns are going to go, basically. So that was the final position. Beautiful game by Duda. Let me just show you that bishop at the start. So that's where the bishop started on b2. That was the situation a few moves on, with all those pawns blocking the diagonal. And then we had this wonderful series of pawn sacrifices. So first of all, takes here, and then clearance, and then a second pawn sacrifice, and that cleared the diagonal. Absolutely stunning attacking game from Jan-Krzysztof Duda. I should mention that actually Arjun Erigaisi is having a fantastic tournament. He's actually in second position at the moment with 24 points. Carlsen's in the lead with 25. Duda has 19 points. He's in sixth position. Remember, it's the top 8 of the 16 players that will go through to the knockout stage. 3 more rounds to play. Giri's in 8th position with 16. Hans Niemann is in 7th position with 18. It's going to be really tight. So do check it out on chess24.com. And as somebody mentioned, there's also excellent coverage on ChessBase India as well, if you prefer their coverage. It's with Sagar Shah and his wife Amruta. They're really, really good. Do check that out as well. Right, let's see what happens. Thanks for watching.